Hi everyone, this is Lilian. We are here for a video, which will be used as an introduction to a series of videos, which will have for goal to speak to you about the lore of Tower of God, and it will be the only video of this series without spoilers. You might find the video a bit boring and a bit off-putting, but for me it is essential to understand the lore of Tower of God. But I'll start with a general introduction of what Tower of God is, so if you're not interested, you can skip this part by going to the timecodes in commentary and description. Tower of God is a Korean webcomic, so you can call it a manhwa, but it's a detail. It is written and published by Slave in Utero, which is often abbreviated by its initials, SIU, even if its real name is Lee Jong-hui, sorry for the pronunciation. It started to be published on June 30th, 2010, so 10 years ago, and it continues today at a weekly rhythm, so we have a chapter in color every week. There are currently 485 chapters. They are published in Korean on the Naver website and then in English 1 week later on Line Webtoon. The official French translation has started only on December 19th, 2019, and continues today on the Webtoon FR website at a rate of 4 chapters per week. As I know that some people have only seen the anime and they do not necessarily know where to read, how it works, all that, I'll make a small explanation. In fact, what you need to know is that the reading mode is really adapted to the smartphone. In fact, when you read, you scroll vertically the screen to see the continuation of the story. So from top to bottom as you see scrolling right now. And in fact, to read in a legal way and without having to pay anything, you have to download the Webtoon app, which is available on iOS and Android. It's free. Or you can go to the Webtoon FR website from your computer, but personally I find it much less convenient. It's more ergonomic to read it from your phone, and moreover, if you read in French, you have my beautiful translations of the author's notes at the end of the chapters that I put in commentary at each chapter, and you can also find them easily as they are among the most liked. The problem is that the translation is only 4 chapters per week. So if you are up to date, and as I told you, it started in December 2019, which means that it is not necessarily up to date. And once you are up to date with this translation, you will have to wait at the rate of the translation, that is to say 4 chapters per day, and this until September 2022, before catching up with the English or Korean chapters. So I understand completely that some people want to rush to read everything at once until chapter 480. And that's what I will do too, but you have 2 solutions. The first is to change the settings of Webtoon, to put the default language in English, and then read the chapters in English until the last chapter released. So currently the 485. So yes, it forces you to read in English, but it's not a very complicated English, and if you're not good in English, it will help you to improve yourself. Honestly, that's the option I recommend the most. And the second option is to go on the fun thread that you can find easily in your favorite illegal scan site. I think you don't need me to find it. But it's true that I recommend it less than reading through the legal platform in English. First of all, because it's illegal, but then, in truth, it's mostly because the French amateur translations, their quality is generally bad. Then, when you're up to date, you'll notice that there's a gap between the last chapter you can read and the last chapter that was actually released. This is due to a system called Fast Pass, which allows you to have 3 chapters in advance, so 3 weeks in advance, by paying 50 cents for the chapter. So of course for the moment it's only in English and Korean, and you will also have 1 week difference between Korean and English, because the English chapter takes 1 week to be translated. So apart from that, for the Fast Pass it's up to you. On the one hand, you can say that it's a bit stupid to pay for something that you'll get for free in the end. But on the other hand, it's true that you have it in advance, and then normally it should support the author, so it's up to you. Also, I encourage you to like the chapters you read on Webtoon, because it supports the author by showing that his work is interesting and by putting it in front of more people. And maybe for us too, because it might allow us to have better translators. And if you're a fanatic like me, you can go like all the English chapters to really support it until the end. Finally, for those who have seen the anime, there are surely some who wonder if it's worth reading from the beginning, or do we start directly from season 2? Honestly, I would rather advise you to reread season 1 because the anime is quite different anyway. It changes quite a lot of things. There are quite a few inconsistencies with the sequel too. There are funny jokes that have been removed. There are a lot of little subtleties that have been removed too. So honestly, I think it's good to rediscover by reading the Webtoon. But then I understand that some people are put off by it because at the beginning the drawing was rather amateurish, and then you might want to go on to the next chapter rather than reread 80 chapters. At the end, what you can do is to read from season 2, and anyway, since you're going to like it and since you're going to reread the Webtoon for a second time, then you'll read it all at once. Well, now that I've finished this global presentation of Tower of God, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the functioning of the lore and about its particularities. In fact, if we wanted to make a synopsis of Tower of God, well, it could be summarized as Bam, the main character who chases a girl named Rachel in a huge tower. But the thing is that in fact it's just the trigger of a much larger story, in which many actors gravitate, and which takes place in a gigantic universe, so that in fact it's quite difficult not to forget anything, and thus to fully grasp the plot, hence the interest of making this series of videos. And to complicate things, the lore itself is quite complicated to understand, and that's why I wanted to make this video in the first place. Indeed, the particularity of the lore of Tower of God is that it can be divided into two categories. On one side, there is the canon lore, that is to say the official content that we can't doubt the existence, and non-canon lore, that is to say content that is not official, and therefore for which we must be careful when we refer to it. But before I start, I'll give the definition of lore for those who don't know it. In fact, the lore is the set of elements that build a fictional universe. So its stories, its customs, its traditions, its functioning, its politics, etc. And so the type of lore that I'm going to talk about first is the canon lore, so it's the one that you'll discover by reading the chapters and the notes that the author writes after each chapter. And it's important to talk about it because there are some subtleties despite the fact that it's canon, and subtleties that you need to understand and have in mind for the following lore videos. First of all, and you know this if you've read it, the story, and therefore the lore of Tower of God, is told to us through its characters, and this poses a problem, the fallible narrator problem. Because indeed these character narrators are an integral part of the plot, so they don't reflect the thoughts of the author. Everything they do and say is determined by the logic of the plot, which is why a character can very well lie about a point in the lore by making the character he is talking to believe something false in order to better trap him and us, the readers. Moreover, these same narrators can tell us things without wanting to, and knowing it. They can very well be mistaken, or manipulated. I mean, it's logical. It's a bit like if you ask a North Korean, what is the best country in the world? He will answer that it's North Korea, and simply because he doesn't know the rest of the world, and because the propaganda of his country has put in his head since he was a child that North Korea is a paradise on earth. That's why it's important to keep in mind that even lore that is canon can turn out to be false. Then, the other problem with canon lore is the translations. I told you earlier in the general introduction to Tower of God that the French fontrades are rather bad, and well, in truth, the official French and English translations are not perfect either. In reality, the best translation that exists is the English fontrade, and even it has its flaws. In any case, from the moment you make a translation, you're bound to miss some information. Usually it's pretty minor stuff, but here, since it's official English and French translations, and considering the level of the French fontrade, well, you can quickly end up with misunderstandings. Well, after I spit on the French fontrade since the beginning, but you have to know that since the beginning of the season 3, it's Electrica who takes care of the French fontrade, and he's very conscientious, and he bases himself on the English fontrade, so the one which is closer to the original in Korean. But the problem is that it's still a translation of a translation, so even with the best translator in the world, when you go through two translations, you distort the information even more. Finally, there's one more thing that you have to take into account in the canonical content, which is the author's notes. In fact, after each chapter, he writes a note where he talks about a lot of stuff. About himself, about the chapter, about his health, about current events, etc. And in fact, in all of this you can find details and anecdotes about the chapter itself, but also about the story. He will give his point of view of author on certain things by explaining his intentions on certain passages, the subtext if there is one, this kind of things. He also does a little bit of teasing from time to time, and we can consider his notes as canon because he has never contradicted himself before, and then he remains quite vague when it comes to future events, and when he is precise we can consider what he says as true. To find his notes, as I said in the introduction, you can find them in comments on Webtoon FR because I translate them after each new chapter, and you can also find them at the end of each chapter of the French fontrade of Electrica, and if you want, I can give you a link to download a Word document where you'll find all the notes that I have currently translated. I'll put one in the description, and if you don't, you can find them all in English in the Tower of God fandom. Just go to the tab, the series, and click on chapters, and you just have to choose the chapter you want to know the note about. So that's it for the canon lore. We're going to move on to the non-canon lore. I'm going to explain to you where it comes from, why it's non-canon, and why you have to be careful when you refer to it. So the first support on which you can find non-canon lore, and the one that is the least interesting, is Twitter. Because yes, SIU has a Twitter account, even if generally he just makes 1 or 2 tweets before releasing his chapter on Sunday to wish us a good week, or tell us a little word about the chapter. But it already happened to him to make some tweets where he gave some information about the story, even if in general it was not very important information. He had also made some questions/answers. He doesn't seem to be too active on Twitter now, but you can always subscribe to follow him. Put a word of encouragement from time to time under his tweets or stuff like that. Then you have all the interviews and discussions with the fans. That's a more consistent source of information. After that, it's more complicated to find them because there are several. You have, for example, questions answers with fans, interviews by journalists. For example, the last interview was the one with Crunchyroll for the release of the anime, of course. So, to find it, you just have to search SIU interview Crunchyroll. But if you want to find it anyway, go to the Tower of God fandom, but it will be in English. And finally, you have the author's blog, made to expand all the content that he has knowingly published on the internet. And this is the biggest part of the non-canon lore. There is a huge amount of information about the lore, but unfortunately it's only available in Korean and in Korea, but everything has been translated into English and published on the fandom. Namely, among all this content, there are some notes that SIU writes and that he didn't make public yet because he said too much about the lore of Tower of God and he considered it a bit of a spoiler. And there was even some content that he published on the internet that he took down because it was too much about the plot. And I'm talking about everything that is related to his Tazl user story universe with all his old comics, and you can only find the screenshots, but I'm not going to go into that today. But the problem with these sources is that they are not totally reliable. In fact, we have the same problem as before, that they are translations. Even if the translation seems reliable, it is still a translation and therefore the information is not 100% accurate. Moreover, sometimes the sources of this content are so old that we can't find the original or the translation, because some sources date even before the publication of Tower of God. So they are more than 10 years old. After all these years, SIU he has time to change his mind, his way of seeing things has evolved, he has more experience as an author, he could have better ideas, etc. Finally, for those who wonder why it's not canon, and well, it's first of all because it didn't appear in the chapters. But in this case you will tell me, why are the author's notes canon? Well, already it's because I see the author's notes as a kind of extension of the chapter, but also because unlike this whole part of the non-canon lore, there were never any inconsistencies because yes, SIU has already contradicted himself in the rest of the story compared to what he had written before in his blog. In fact, you have to understand one thing, SIU writes his story like a plotter's. To translate into French, we could say that it is a structural writing, because it is a way of writing that consists in having in mind the whole story before starting to really write it, like an architect who would make a detailed plan of the house before building it. If I had to quote the most famous examples in manga, there would be of course One Piece and Attack on Titans. It's the kind of plots where you'll find a lot of foreshadowing, a perfect plot that gives the impression to have no incoherence, etc. But the mistake not to make, and that people unfortunately do too often, is to believe that absolutely everything is written from the beginning. Indeed, and this is even more true in long stories, there is always a big part of improvisation. If we return to the metaphor of the architect has written the plans for the house, but he hasn't built it yet. Maybe as he builds it, he'll realize that there are things that don't work, that some things would be better if they were done differently, that we could add things to make the thing prettier. Well, it's exactly the same when they build a story. In fact, you can be sure that a plotter will have a main plot that will not change, but everything that is built around it, that is all the details, the subplots, the secondary characters, etc. Well, they are written as the plot progresses. And if you want a proof that One Piece and SNK were not entirely written from scratch from the beginning, just tell yourself that One Piece was only supposed to have 30 volumes and SNK was only supposed to have 20. And that's why in the case of Tower of God, the non-canon lore has to be well differentiated from the canon lore. It should be considered as the author's draft, as ideas that he has to integrate in the story, to modify or not to put at all, because as long as it remains coherent with everything that has been published before, these changes are possible. Finally, to conclude, I would also say that the lore of Tower of God is discovered as the plot progresses, that it evolves constantly, and that even after 10 years of existence, the webtoon gives us the impression that we only know the submerged part of the iceberg. This series of videos will inevitably become obsolete with time, but it doesn't matter. I hope it will at least refresh the memory from time to time. So let's meet again for the next video, which will be the first video of the series, and which will talk about the structure of the tower.